Hi, I'm Alex. I'm an archaeologist, and I'm here to talk to you guys about archaeology. I'm actually a Western Mediterranean archaeologist. I work primarily in Spain and Italy. Currently finishing my PhD in archaeology at Brown University, but I'm excited to be in Rochester talking to Rochesterians right now because I am, in fact, a Rochesterian. So what we have in front of us is actually a demonstration of what it's like to be in the field as an archaeologist. So stratigraphy is one of the most basic concepts of archaeology and one of the things that I, as an archaeologist, deal with on a daily basis in the field. Stratigraphy is a complicated word meaning basically just layers in the dirt. So layers in the dirt are incredibly important for us for understanding a number of different processes in archaeology, including chronology, which is probably the most important thing. But what we have right here is a box full of not quite dirt. For right now, we're going to pretend that the dirt inside of here, these towels, are actually dirt that you would see in the field. But as you can see immediately, what we have on the side is layers in the dirt itself, different colors, different textures. So one of the basic ways that archaeologists differentiate between different layers is by very basically color is very important, but also texture, sometimes thickness of the layer, and the feel of the layer itself. There's of course a lot of different other scientific methods that are involved, but the basic ones are very, very important for practicing archaeology to understand. So if we take the lid off here, the first thing we have is this green layer. And this is a very convenient layer because often where we start in archaeology is with the grass or with the vegetation on top. So sometimes when we do prospection or we do like a survey of the area on the grass, we find things on the surface itself. For instance, what we have right here, what do you think that is? It's a coin, right? So it's a nice, very pretty coin in the sense that it's not very scuffed, it's not very tarnished. It looks fairly new, and it is Turkish. So right now we're actually in a dig in Turkey itself. So we're going through these different layers and be looking at different civilizations that actually inhabit Turkey. But this is a Turkish coin, and if we were to think about it, it's very, very close to the surface, and it's also in very, very good condition. So how old does that mean? It is. Well, essentially, right? It's in great condition. It's very, very young. It's going to be super young. And we actually have a date on here. It's 2009. We always love dates in archaeology. And although ancient people weren't really using calendars that we would recognize, that your normal person would recognize today, and they weren't putting dates on their coins themselves, we can still date ancient coins very, very accurately, sometimes to specific years. And this is really important for us as archaeologists to understand the actual layers themselves, how old they are. We have a very young coin right here, but you could find a similar coin from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, other ancient civilizations around the world that would give us just as much information. Not to mention, what's awesome about coins is they often have leader or god's faces on them, as well as some sort of symbol of the culture on the back. So right here we have a picture of Ataturk and then a Turkish one with the Turkish symbols on the back. So this is very, very important for us. So we take off this first green layer, our grass surface layer. We get down to this layer right here. And one thing you notice about it immediately is that the color is darker, right? It's very, very dark. And this is pretty typical in archaeology. What you have in the subsurface, the immediate layers below the grass, is very highly oxidized dirt full of vegetal material and various animal traces. So it's a lot richer, it's a lot darker, and right here we have a dark layer. And inside of the dark layer, we have this right here. Now you might wonder, oh, how old could these possibly be? And there's a telltale sign right here. And if you look closely, the beads themselves, they might last a really long time, right? But what about the string? The string is made out of organic material, materials made out of other living beings. So this case is probably made out of cotton or something similar. And these do not survive very well underground at all. They only survive for a couple of years, maybe. In places like Egypt, or areas where there's no water, it's very, very dry, or things are really super well preserved in rare situations, you might find this. But the vast majority of the time, most of the time, you never find this. So, that means, despite the fact that these beads look pretty old, the string tells us that, in fact, this was deposited not that long ago, maybe 10 years ago at most. Also, animals love to eat these things. So, any organic material is just going to get chowed down by your closest squirrel or earthworm. So we take off this next dark layer and we get down to a lighter layer. And this means that we're probably in a little bit more of an ancient deposit, something a little drier, something that's been there a lot longer. And what we have inside of this lighter layer is this right here. So this, kind of hard to see from where you are, but what it is actually metal, right? Metal survives much better underground than something like string, something organic, but not nearly as well as something like ceramic. So metal is a great substance. For a couple hundred years it survives, depending on the conditions that it's in, but it doesn't survive the longest. So what we have here is an interesting shape too. If you look at the shape itself, there's a lot of small circles connecting to one another. And you might think, oh, this is a nice little earring or something like that. These are all good things to assume. As archaeologists, one of the things we have to do is look at what we have and try to figure out what it is. Because usually there's no easy roadmap to tell us what it is. Also, we can tell that this is probably not the whole object, right? This is probably just part of the object. And this is what we have to do in archaeology as well, is figure out the larger object based on just a small little piece of it. Because sometimes that's all that survives. So what we have right here, if you look very closely, this is actually chainmail. If you think about what society used chainmail, immediately the Crusaders pop into mind, right? Medieval people like knights were using chainmail to actually protect themselves. And although we don't have the whole body of armor, we do have this little piece, which possibly tells us of the existence of Crusaders passing through the area in this little place in Turkey, potentially. So what we're doing now is we're going through the layers themselves chronologically. So if you think about our first object, it's from 2009. Our second object and the slightly darker layer, the very dark layer, was from 10 years ago, 15 years ago maybe, because of the string, right? Well, this object, we're in the medieval period right now. Now, that's about 700 years ago, 500 to 800 years ago, in fact. So we have a very old object. We've jumped a lot in time. But this happens in archaeology. You can jump hundreds of years in a matter of inches. But of course, the one thing that we do know is that the further down we go, the older the objects are going to get. So if we take off this next layer, we get down to a slightly lighter layer, like a yellow layer right here, and we have two objects. Uh-oh. So we have a conundrum on our hands. We have one object right here, which is made out of ceramic, one object right here, which is made out of, well, this is a pretty hard one, but ancient glass. So ancient glass actually starts to look like this over time. It develops like a crust and turns green, sometimes these carnival colors, rainbow colors over time. So the real problem, it's not that uncommon to find multiple objects in the same layer. In fact, it's incredibly common in archaeology. But our big problem right here is that not only are these different types of materials, but they're from different time periods. So this is actually a Roman piece of glass. And if you know your chronology, you'll know that that's about 2,000 years old. Not only is that really old, but it's pretty awesome that such a nice piece of glass actually survives from that period. It's very pretty. But this other object right here is a little bit older. It's actually Greek. So this is probably around 2,400 years old, right? So there's a 400-year difference between the two. But if you remember your history books, you'll remember that both the Greeks and the Romans were at various points in Turkey. So this is not that weird. So we're looking at two civilizations that were probably interacting in the area of Turkey and depositing their artifacts. So with this logical conundrum we have here, we have a very big problem. We have two very differently dated objects. So it's a little bit of a logical jump to get to this point, but what you have to remember is that they're in the same layer together, which means they were deposited at the same time. So if they were deposited at one point in time, the youngest object must be the best datable object for the entire layer. The younger object won't be inserted into an older deposit, because that's impossible. Logically, that's impossible. So what we have to go by now is the fact that the youngest object is from 2,000 years ago. That means that this layer must be from 2,000 years ago. And you might wonder, well, why is there a 400-year-old pot in this layer? Well, if you think about it, if you have something that your grandfather or your great-grandfather passed down to you, an heirloom or something really old in your house, and you break it, and you have to throw it out, unfortunately, you're going to throw it out in the same trash that you throw out your stuff from today. So essentially what you have is a deposit that has these very old materials in it, but is actually just your daily trash from the modern period. So if you think about it that way, it's not that weird to have older pots or older artifacts around. In fact, it's a very, very common thing for humans to do. So we get through this next layer. We've already gone 2,400 years, or 2,000 years rather. That's quite a long ways. We get down to a slightly larger layer. And what we have here is a different color again. This might have to do with the way the area is being used, maybe the type of house, the type of things they were cooking. A lot of different factors go into that. But what we have are a series of objects, this time dating to approximately the same period, but from two different cultures again. And right here, what we have is a nice little piece. As you can see, you probably guessed it already, it's Egyptian. We have the god Osiris and Isis on here. But this is obviously not the whole piece, right? It's a little bit broken off. And again, this is normally what we find in archaeology, is just the broken pieces themselves. So we have this Egyptian example right here. It's pretty nice, probably around 3,000 years old or so. But then we look to our other objects in this layer, and we have this. And this, if you look closely, is a Cuneiform Tablet. So these are, this is an example of early writing in Mesopotamia. And this is, again, probably around 3,000 years old or so, the same time period as the Egyptian artifact. But you have an early example of writing, and this is how people would actually communicate with each other before, or instead of things like papyrus or paper. Papyrus did exist, but it was a little bit more expensive. Clay was awesome because you could just ball up a bunch of clay, stamp in what you wanted to say, and then send it off. Let it dry and send it off. It was the great letter writing platform, letter writing media of the ancient world for a very long time. So we have this Mesopotamian object as well. And we have another Mesopotamian object right here, which we call a cylinder seal. Now you might think immediately, oh, this is a bead. You can see the hole right here. And it might have been used as some sort of bead or to be affixed to someone, but if you actually put down a wet piece of clay and roll this object on it, you'll get an image because the surface of this object is incised, has little tiny pictures on it, and you have an image like this. And this image was basically an ancient person's signature. They would put this on their objects that they owned when they were being transported or something similar to that, in order to claim them as their own, to sign them in a way. But we have all these great objects. We have our cylinder seal, we have our Cuneiform Tablet, we have a piece of Egyptian possibly architecture. It seems to be made out of limestone. All these things would survive for thousands of years in the soil, luckily. And we have them together, but what does it mean that they're actually together? From the same time period, but different cultures. Now, if you think about it, this might have more to do with something like trade. Perhaps things are moving back and forth across borders of civilizations. Trade is actually influencing the things that are coming into Turkey at this period. And there was definitely interactions between people in Turkey and Mesopotamians, as well as Egyptians during this period. There was a lot of interaction in the ancient world, and that's something that you can never really downplay, because you will find stuff all over the place. Alexandrian, things from Alexander the Great all the way in India, things from the Mycenaeans all the way in Spain. It's just crazy how much people moved in antiquity. So if we chalk that up to trade, we've gone down 3,000 years. We got an interesting civilization sort of intermixing going on. And now we're getting down to our final layer. And what we have down here is a huge chunk of dirt, right? So a lot of dirt is being taken out right now. And that is usually a good indication that a lot of time has gone by, right? Because dirt somewhat steadily builds up unless you're doing construction, or have a period where you're throwing out a lot of stuff. Generally, dirt is fairly steady, so the thicker the layer, sometimes the longer it takes. Although when you're building a house, you can make a lot of dirt, it's true. But what we have right here is probably the most lasting object you can imagine, is a stone tool. So stone tools are made out of, obviously, stone, right? So they last for thousands, in fact, millions of years. And although this is not millions of years old, this stone tool is about 6,000 years old. So it's still pretty old. How it would have been used in antiquity is interesting. If you look at it from the side, it's like, oh, maybe an axe or something like that. Well, you can see from the top, the wear marks on the top, as well as some wear pattern right here, that this was probably used for smashing or grinding. So you could use it in a couple of ways. You could affix a wooden handle onto here and use it for chopping. You could actually hold it like that and grind it down, or you could hold it like this and chop as well. But this was a very durable, very long-lasting artifact, and it's from a very early chapter in human history in Turkey, 6,000 years ago. Although it's not the earliest chapter, it's still a very early chapter. So this actually constitutes the last identifiable phase of human occupation. And when I say last, I mean first, because we've gone down to the bottom of where we can actually see human activity. And in real life, the dirt would keep going, or you would hit bedrock, but usually the dirt would keep going. Right here, luckily, we have the end of the box. However, in the field, you basically have to get to a point where you realize you're not going to find anything else. You keep digging for a little while, make sure that you're not going to find anything else, and then you call the layer a sterile layer, and you stop. And that's essentially how you do excavation, how you start digging, and how you understand stratigraphy.